one has to remember that increasing GDP is not an end in itself. The object of development is increasing the well-being of most citizens in the country. If you have an increasing GDP, but inequality increases to the point where most citizens are not sharing, where the growth is not inclusive, then you have failed. One of the most important aspects of inclusive development is providing employment. And at early stages of development, historically, industrialization has played an absolutely central role. Going forward, I think we'll have to take a broader view of what we mean. What we mean is going from the primitive sectors, the agricultural sectors, the traditional sectors, to more advanced sectors. And some of these are labeled service, some of them are labeled manufacturing. The real point is the structural transformation of the economy from a traditional economy to the characteristics of a more developed economy. What is very clear is that the world needs a commitment to reduce carbon emissions beyond the levels which are likely to be achieved through the voluntary commitments. My concern has been that the basic framework of the Paris talks is voluntary commitments. Economists refer to the problem of climate change as a global public good. And one of the most important insights of global public goods is that there needs to be commitments, binding commitments, to reduce, in this case, carbon emissions. I was not very optimistic that those binding commitments would add up to anything near what would be required to achieve what was stated back in Copenhagen as the goal of 2 degrees. And now that the numbers have come in, it's absolutely clear that there's a huge gap. From the political point of view, the problem is very clear. It is going to be very difficult to get the United States to agree to a binding commitment. So within those constraints, I actually am optimistic that Paris will succeed, will be a step forward. It's not the step forward that I would have liked had one been able to move the United States to join the international community to address the problems. I think the Obama administration needs to be commended for what they have done in terms of the executive orders in the reducing of carbon emissions. So there's been contributions, significant. I think really the significance of the Paris meeting will be the following: that the world will be put on notice that progress is being made, that there will be a series of meetings going forward, and those series of meetings going forward will successfully ratchet down the level of emissions so that a little later than I would have hoped, one will achieve the goal of sufficient emissions to achieve the 2 degree centigrade goal. I think this is really important that there is this global recognition of the direction in which we're moving, because businesses are engaged in making long-term investments. Households, real estate are all making long-term commitments. And if they see the price of carbon effectively going up, they will begin to make decisions today that reflect the need to reduce carbon emissions. And there's a broad sentiment going on, which I think is very important, for divestment of coal assets, of moving away from these especially highly emitting fossil fuels. I think that movement of civil society, which is being effective, is going to be part of this global commitment. It's not just governments that are changing the world we have, but it's a broad swath of civil society that's beginning to have a real effect. I don't think you can rely on the private sector for addressing the problems of pollution, which they basically have created. As an economist, we simply focus on incentives. And that's particularly true in the short-sighted capitalism that has evolved in the last half of the 20th century and continuing to the 21st. Companies look to their shareholders. They say our responsibility is maximizing shareholder return, very short-sighted. Quite often they're focusing just on the quarterly, sometimes it's even in the weekly return. Well, when you're so short-sighted, you're obviously not looking at the big issues like climate change. If they can make a profit today, they are not going to sacrifice their shareholders for the well-being of society. Now, I can say that's true of most companies, not all. They'll make some commitment to corporate responsibility, put in the right light bulb, even as they invest in very dirty coal generating power plants. So their PR is very good about corporate social responsibility, but the actuality is often very different. So in my mind, you cannot rely on the private sector, but the private sector can be part of the solution if you give them the right incentives. And that means if we have a high enough price of carbon, which I think it should be very high, then they have an incentive to find solutions that are consistent with that high price of carbon. And that's where I think they can be very innovative. But first, we have to have a price of carbon, and that is what should have been going on in Paris. Not likely to come out of Paris, but if there is at least a recognition in Paris that there will, in the future, be this high price of carbon, it can begin to incentivize firms to economize, to reduce the level of emissions from what they've had in the past. I think that African countries can't industrialize without the very significant adverse environmental effects that marked China, that marked Asia, that marked Europe in the 19th and early 20th century. In fact, once one begins to focus on the objective of industrialization, which is increasing standards of living, which is not just GDP, then you have to say you have to look at the environmental consequences. Otherwise, industrialization could lead to lower standards of living appropriately defined. We now have the technology in which we can industrialize in a green way. And I think there is both the pressure from civil society. I hope that there will eventually be an international agreement for a high carbon price enforced through cross-border taxes. That is to say, countries that don't abide by having a high carbon price will be charged when they export their goods. And that will provide incentives for all countries to impose a carbon tax, and that will provide incentives for firms in all countries, including Africa, to industrialize in an environmentally sound way. I think UNIDO can contribute in a number of ways to the achievement of the Sustainable Goal 9 and the other goals. There are other goals, for instance, inclusive growth, which are part of the UNIDO agenda, goal number 10. Partly this has to do with how one shapes development, how one shapes industrialization. If you have support dirty industrialization, coal-based power plants, then you're going to get unsustainable industrialization. If you support highly capital intensive technologies. In countries with limited amounts of capital, there won't be very many jobs. You'll have a few jobs with people doing relatively well and most people not doing very well. So if one starts to focus on industrialization as a means to these broader ends rather than an end in itself, then one starts to ask, how can we shape industrialization? There are choices. There are all kinds of choices that confront countries as they decide which sectors and which technologies to use. And if they keep in mind what are the broader goals of industrialization, broader goals of development, they can then shape industrialization to be both inclusive and sustainable.